Tshwane yesterday continued its crackdown and disconnection of state-owned entities as well as businesses that owe millions of rand in unpaid services. Let's expand on this further now and look at the importance of rate payments to services and for service delivery, rather. We're joined by Danga, Program Manager. Thank you very much for joining us. He's with Well-Governed Cities at the South African Cities Network. This has divided opinion in the country, with some people saying, well, it's not necessarily the what that is being done, it's the how that is, how it is done. Your thought or reflection on how the city has embarked on this?
Thank you for having me. Well, clearly it's always going to be a contentious issue. I mean, all of us who are in a position where we're dependent on electricity and water for us to either to do our daily business or even just to subsist in a family home are worried when those connections and those services are cut off. I think the issue then is, has the city engaged with ratepayers who've been defaulting for a long period of time, and what has been the degree of that engagement, I think, because I think if people understood the importance of the payment of municipal bills, then perhaps the reaction and indeed the attitude towards paying those bills might be different, and in which case you would see that the uproar perhaps be slightly less. But I do understand, of course, that it's a difficult situation both for city residents and for the city itself to be in, and not a desirable one.
Are we likely to see some court action? And I ask you maybe because of how the process was done, we are none the wiser in terms of whether notices were given to some of these companies or some of, these businesses. Any idea on your end?
Unfortunately, I think your guess is as good as mine. I am not aware of the details, as you say, of specific negotiations, perhaps between the largest defaulters, according to the city and the city itself, or indeed individual consumers who perhaps have been cut off. Clearly, a legal situation is the last resort, and like with any other dispute between two parties, ideally you'd like to resolve it amicably before it gets to the legal stage.
And I guess this is all being done in the name of collecting monies that are owed to the municipalities. How much do rates contribute to service delivery?
Well, rates, in fact, are a very big and important part of city revenues. So we look at the big metropolitan municipalities, including, of course, Tshwane, and what we find is what we call own revenues. So this is revenues that the cities themselves are able to raise to meet that they then spend for the various activities that the city has to do. And property rates contribute about 14 to 22% across the 8 metropolitan municipalities and Sunduzi to their own revenue, so that part of own revenue. So, and the reason it's so important is because that revenue is entirely within the city's control. So the city is able to determine what that revenue will be based on the property values on the valuation roll. And then they're also able to collect that revenue, and there's no middle party, if you will, in that process. So that's entirely the city's own revenue. So the other part of a municipal bill, which you'll be aware of, which is paying for electricity and paying for water, those are a form of municipal revenue, own revenue, but it's only a slight percentage that the city is able to charge on top of what it pays Eskom and the water boards for that electricity and that water. So it's more of a pass-through kind of revenue than a dedicated pot of money which cities are able to and can plan and budget around with property rates. And the other important thing to note in the case of electricity and water is those are based on consumption. So if consumption is very high and consumers and businesses pay for that consumption, then the city can expect, a higher amount of revenue. But if consumption goes down, whether because residents are feeling the pinch, deciding to spend less money on electricity and water, or indeed through a drought, for example, then the city's revenues go down. So it fluctuates, and that's why rates are such an important source, dependable source of revenue.
I found this rather curious. So the Department of Infrastructure Development owes the municipality some 245 million rand, the Department of Public Works owing 110 million rand. So one wonders when it comes to you and I what they will do if they can disconnect, government entities. So how much of the municipality's functionality depends on government allocations?
Well, I mean, speaking to those departments which owe large amounts of money, I mean, I think that is something that, ideally should be resolved between intergovernmental relations forums. As you know, we have the three spheres of government, and they're supposed to be co-equal and should in fact be resolving bills like this amongst themselves. I'm assuming your question is also asking about how much government contributes to the revenues of cities in terms of the local government equitable share and then also conditional grants. And just to give you some sense, I mean, the cities, as I mentioned, the big cities we focus on, are able to raise anything from about 76 to 79% of all their revenue actually on their own. So whether through property rates, through surcharges on electricity and water, and various other things like charges for sanitation and waste removal. When it comes to government allocations, the equitable share is 9% nationally across countries, but in the big cities ranges from around 7% to maybe 11% of city revenue. And then the other grants which come from national government, which are called conditional grants, so for things like public transport or upgrading informal settlements or whatever the case may be, for specific things, those amount also to about, between 7 and 10%. So in fact, the large metropolitan municipalities are not really dependent on, transfers from local government, maybe to the maximum of about 20% of their revenue source.
What to say when businesses say, well, if you are disconnecting us and we're not able to perform our duties, we won't be able to then pay back this money that we owe you? What kind of agreements do you perceive will be reached?
Well, I think this goes to something, and we get this sort of advice, you and I, as individual debtors. We're always told to maintain honest lines of communication with people who've lent you money. So in the case of an individual, a bank. In the same case, we would suggest, from a urban management perspective, that stakeholders who owe money, they can see a bill coming and they can see the bill increasing if they're in particular circumstances, to engage with the cities. And I think through that engagement and discussing particular circumstances, and particularly in the case where it's a very large debtor, then the interests are both in the city's interests and in the debtor's interest to try and resolve that. So, for example, during the recent ongoing COVID pandemic, I think various municipalities were actually offering to individual consumers, delays in charges on their bills because some people were out of work and so on. So I think there are arrangements that can be made, and I think it's based on having an ongoing conversation between debtors and the city, and so they can resolve these situations amicably, and you don't get to the point where the city is forced, because at some point you cannot continue supplying services which are not being paid for. That's just a reality, and at some point, and as unfortunate as it is that some businesses have to stop operating, it doesn't have to necessarily get to that point.
Thank you very much for helping us make sense of all of that. Danga is the Program Manager at Well-Governed Cities at the South African Cities Network.